Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Bible and Brekkie. We're glad to be back. We took a little hiatus. Now we took a little break last week. We know, as you all know, and if you don't know now, you will know. We are all pastors, and so obviously especially during the pandemic now, it's been quite busy with different things. So, yeah, so it's just a busy day. But we're back at it. Romans 13, excited. But before we get into the word. And before we get into the what we're eating or what we're doing for breakfast, any thoughts on sports coming back? I know NBA had its first game yesterday. Baseball has been playing, I think, for the last week or so. Anybody have any thoughts on predictions? How you feeling?
The teams that sucked still suck. That has not changed.
All right, so
Unfortunately.
nothing.
Sadly, yeah.
So that's
sadly.
like the Knicks, the Mets. No.
Hey,
Oh,
whoa.
Hey, the Knicks got a new coach though, so that's good. You know,
They
got
do. Conte Bell, he's pretty
he's
solid.
gonna give none of his players rest, but it's cool.
Right.
You know,
It's good.
It's like we go hard every practice.
They don't deserve rest.
That's true.
They're not that good, so they don't deserve.
They don't deserve playing time either, though. So it's
yeah.
Yo, maybe we should go into sports commentating after. All right.
Just a quick thought on MLB reopening.
Yeah.
As a case study for opening too soon and not having enough restrictions. The Miami Marlins had 17 players.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Yeah. Come on, Brian. What are you guys doing down there? But the fun fact is that they did not contract the virus in Miami. They contracted the virus while they were on the road in Atlanta. And so it seems like they had like a night out with the team. Players went, some staff, and so 17 all for one organization. That's a huge outbreak.
Yeah. Wow.
At first, the report was like maybe 2 or 3 players got it, and then all of a sudden, the number just kept on getting bigger and bigger. Went to 7, and then 17. So, yeah, I do think that some of these players are going to get sick more and more, and I mean it's the Miami Marlins, so no one really.
I feel like baseball just continued
cares for the Marlins just because historically they haven't been that good. But I think if one of these big players like a Mike Trout or an Aaron Judge or Jacob DeGrom, if they get sick, man.
Wait, who's that third guy?
That's the back-to-back Cy Young Award winner, brother, for the New York Mets. Yeah, I think if one of these big players get the virus, they're just going to shut down the season, which I do think it's the best decision that they can go, just because the players' health and their families' health is more important than our entertainment.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, I feel like that's the difference, right? Between like the NBA was a little bit easier for them to go into the bubble. Like it's hard, but I think there's less players on a team compared to like baseball and football. So so far the NBA's been doing good, with the exception of like Lou Williams, which is
it's been doing good. We started last night, but it's going.
But they've been in there for 3 weeks, so they had like 0
I think,
tests. So
I think the big thing is just like the approach that they took. Like MLS, NBA, WNBA, they all took the bubble approach, right? Whereas baseball's kind of like, y'all fend for yourself, we'll be good. And I mean, it makes sense because the sport, there's not a lot of contact as it is on the field, right? But still, I mean, you're traveling from place to place. And I think that's if anybody's going to, shut down first, I think MLB will be.
Yeah.
And thankfully, at least in NBA, it's more closed in. And so as long as nobody comes in with it, you might be okay.
Yeah. It's hard to get 30-something baseball teams to come to one place and play, I don't know, like every other day. I think the advantage that the NBA had was that their season was about to end anyway. And so they can kind of just do the shortened version of the remainder of those games and then plus the playoffs, which is already a limited amount of teams. Whereas baseball was just starting their season,
Right.
which is also the longest season out of any sport in the United States, with 162 games. So they shortened the season to 60 games, which no one really wanted to play anyway. The MLB union, the players union, rejected that deal a number of times until they finally realized, like, this is all we're going to get.
Right.
So, yeah, it's mixed feelings for me. I like seeing baseball again. I like watching my Mets lose again, though it's heartbreaking. But yeah, man, I'd rather have the players' safety go first than my entertainment. That's just my opinion.
That's good. That's true. That's true. Very good. All right. I mean, we can spend all day in sports, but moving into what are you eating? What are you doing for breakfast? Anybody eating anything or drinking anything? Nah. Water. All right. Drink more water. I have my last bit of a bagel.
I have my mate. Water is heating up right now, so
are you drinking it? Like or you have your bombilla?
Yeah, my
bombilla. Okay. I thought it was.
Yeah, I do the
banana bread and mate. You already saw.
Yeah, I got my mate too.
Yeah.
Shout out to Libertador San Martín.
Yeah.
Te invita a volver. So
I gotta say, man, that new countdown video, it was nice. I felt like for a moment it was like one of those songs that you'd play as the camera is panning through like a highway for like a runner, Okay. And it was really inspiring. And then our video started, but I mean it was kidding. But it was good. It was good. I like that new thing you did there, Seba.
Hey, shout out to StreamYard. They set it up for us. So if you're using StreamYard, you're gonna find that new countdown that they have. So thankfully they've been changing and evolving as the time goes on, to fit everyone's needs. So
yeah,
that's been good. Well, we lost Gabe there for a second, but he'll be back.
Probably getting his water.
Right. Now we gotta get Steven a mate, bro.
Yeah, we gotta get you a.
Yeah, and then I guess I'll be official, right? It's like the initiation.
This is initiation, yeah. It's a great way, and I learned this from Brian recently, that if you're in a meeting, you just pull this out as you're drinking, and it makes the other person have to talk, right, in your Zoom meeting. So you're just like,
it's true.
Or even if they ask you a question, you're like, yeah, that's a good question. Like, let me think about it, and drinking my mate. But yeah, it's a great way to stain your teeth. So just think about it.
Give you that bitter breath. All right, yo. So we're moving into Romans 13. We've been going through the book of Romans, as we've mentioned before and earlier. It's really been, I know for me, I know the guys have expressed it too, a blessing to be able to go through it and really understand it for what Paul's trying to talk about now, and really just dive into it without any biases or any preconceived ideas. And so now we're moving into chapter 13. It seems that 13, 14, 15, and on is now kind of what does it look like to live by the Spirit. Paul's been talking through, what it's like to be humans, how all humans have fallen and how God has provided salvation and righteousness by his work and his work only. And he's also been encouraging people to live by the Spirit and not by their own flesh or their own desires, but to be, not seeking to, not seeking to gain their own righteousness by their works, because we can't, but it's only by the Spirit that we can be made righteous. So we continue to Romans 13. So I'm just going to read the first 7 verses here. And Paul goes on and says, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities. For there's no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong, do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and you will be commended. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath, to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience. This is also why you pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants who give their full time to governing. Give to everyone what you owe them. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. A lot there, a lot to chew on. Thoughts? Any thoughts?
No, I think like you said, he's bringing his whole argument into a place where he actually talks about what being a Christian, like what it looks like, how it's something that's tangible. It's not like, oh, one day I will become a better person. It's like, no, you can be that better person like right now. And these are just a couple of ways that he's describing that you can do that. Basically, just summarizing what we just read, it's like, be a good citizen, like do your duty as a citizen of whatever nation you're a part of. And I think it's something important. It's always context, right? Yeah. And so to Paul's day, up until that point, these authorities, these nations, they were just like one person, the king. And so like the king stood for the whole nation's authority. Mm-hmm. And I think we can't really translate that to today. Right. You can't be like, oh, the one authority over everything is like, whoever you think that person may be. But I think that Paul is speaking more broadly than just like a representative or a congressman. Mm-hmm. He's speaking like as a nation, the authority that the nation has. Not just that, though. I think that just reading into this and kind of trying to apply it to today, I see that unlike in Paul's time, we have the same responsibility that these authorities have. And what I mean by that is that the United States was probably one of the first to have this whole democracy thing where we all have a say, we all have a vote. Right. And in a sense, we are all part of this governing authority. Mm-hmm. And so the responsibility of what you vote for, what you stand for, how vocal you are about it, doesn't just lay with those who have been voted into office. Mm-hmm. It's also your responsibility as a good citizen, as Paul is saying, to stand up for these things and to give honor when honor is due and respect when respect is due. Good. And that's something that we tend to overlook. It's like, oh, Paul's just talking about the responsibility that someone that's in a leadership role has, mm-hmm. like a pastor or a president, and not comparing the two, obviously, but but it has nothing to do with me, where in fact it does.
That's good. Good.
Yeah, that's good. I think the challenge with this text is often we read it in isolation. Right. We just read Romans 13 and reading those verses, we apply it to every government, every ruling body, every authority on earth in all circumstances. I think that is a irresponsible hermeneutic. When you look at other instances in the Bible, you see pictures of clear civil disobedience, not just being sanctioned by God, but also being the methodology through which God brings about a huge, turning of the tide in favor of somebody, So I think of Esther. Mm-hmm. She interrupts basically this scheme that is a part of legislation. And she goes in and she voices her opinion, obviously putting her body on the line so that the Jews wouldn't get slaughtered. I think of also John the Baptist, who was vocal about Herod and his personal, bedroom life, calling him out, holding him accountable to the decision that he was making. And I think that's important to consider all things inside the Bible as well, not just reading this passage in isolation and saying, here, look, as Christians, we don't have the authority to resist governments because God establishes all rulers. What's important is to remember that we also, as Brian said, we have a responsibility to hold leaders accountable to that call, right? To God's sovereignty, especially in such a country like this that has this grand idea of democracy, right? To live in a place where the people have a voice, and we have to utilize that voice. And so what's interesting is that this passage, Paul is writing to the Romans, and the emperor, it seems, is Nero, who obviously, if you guys know, Nero eventually has this whole scheme and plot against the Jews and the Christians there, to blame them on the mishaps of his own, city. And so they face really bad persecution under Nero. Mm-hmm. I don't think Paul's idea is for them to just, go with the flow. It seems to me in this text, and I don't know about you guys, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that the Christians in Rome may have been unwilling to pay their taxes. And so it seems like Paul is building up this whole entire council so that he can get there to verse 6. Because this, you pay taxes. And so he's kind of urging them to do their duty and responsibility in paying their taxes. I'm not sure if that's the reason why he's saying all these things, but it seems to me that is the direction of the text. That's the reason why he's saying what he's saying.
Right. That's good. I think that goes, I was reading a social science commentary, kind of going to what you and Brian were saying, where, it's like you can't really apply what we believe of the government to this, which I've heard so many sermons about it, right? Where it's like, obey your governing officials, which is, I think Brian had hit on the head, right? Where you do need to live it in amiable and respectful ways, right? Be model citizens and whatever that means and whatnot. But what he was saying here, what Bruce Molina in the kind of the context of what's going on, he was just saying that what Paul is speaking to is an elitist system that's rooted in political patronage, with ranking officials acquiring ascribed positions. So it's people that are like born into it, like emperors and kings, kind of, we think of what is it, England, and how they have their kings that are passed on and their queens. So it's something like that. And so where now with the democracy, where we are, the people vote for what they want, right? Back then it was like you had this person in power, so you had to live in a way that honored them, and because they were the only access to whatever you needed to be able to get, right? So you needed these people and live a good life in relation to them, so that you could get land and get goods, get protection, and whatever it was. So obviously it's a different time and place, but I think the principle does land there, which is just be model citizens, right? Kind of even like the last part of chapter 12, right? Don't be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Kind of the idea of, I think that's why my point there, right? In verse 18, if it is possible in chapter 12, 12:18, if it's possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone, right? So as Christians in this world, living in the Spirit, you need to, as far as possible, live at peace with everyone. But as Gabe, put, Nero ends up persecuting. Like by the time Nero's in power at this moment that Paul is writing, he ends up persecuting the Christians. So they're not going to be like, oh yeah, the government, And then not just that, but he's the one that he ends up killing Paul. So it's like, it's kind of the same way, the predicament that we're at now, where you have a lot of people that be like, yeah, the government, be loyal, whatever, the president or government says. But then you have to pit it with the backdrop of Revelation 13, which we know U.S. plays a prominent, if not the most prominent role in end time history and prophecy. So you have to gauge those two, right? Okay, I do have to live as a model citizen. I do have to, do my civic duties of paying taxes, because it's true, right? You're paying these people, just like, pastors, right? You're paying pastors to be able to preach the word. You're paying, hopefully, good politicians and representatives of your communities to do and enact laws that will help your communities. So yeah, I'm gonna hand it up because everyone's barking over here. But that's my point.
I like how you connected it to prophecy. I think that's essential. Revelation 13, obviously, talks about the end time, I guess, ruler and how that's going to play. And we historically, as a faith tradition, have connected the United States to that prophecy. And so, as you said, yeah, we should be responsible citizens, do our civic duty, live and love well as neighbors. But we should not have this unwavering allegiance to nation, because one day, according to prophecy, this is going to happen. And so I think that's kind of the route that Paul is taking as well, because again, like he gets arrested many times for preaching the gospel, which kind of seems to contradict his own counsel here, so how do we reconcile the two? So yeah, I think this is a little bit more than what we often get from this text. My personal opinion, I think he's talking about taxes, but who knows? Maybe there's another theologian that can.
Yeah, no, I think he's definitely talking about taxes. That's what I think. And he says it bluntly. He doesn't like go around in circles. And this is also why you pay taxes, and I think that at some point, like I said before, it's all about like God choosing or selecting nations to do a certain thing, right? To kind of align to this whole like prophecy, and it just goes back to this key verse where the Israelites are taken captives, and the message from God is like, hey man, where you are, like be successful, like thrive, like get married, open shop, businesses. Just do what you would do and thrive there. But remember, I'm gonna call you back, and bring you back to me. And so, like as citizens, especially as Christians, we have to understand like where we are. Like I don't care if you call it Babylon or whatever the heck you want to call it. We are called to thrive here, like where we are right now. And as we're thriving, just be a constant reminder of what's coming up next when he's going to talk about like the second coming and love and all this stuff. And so part of that is paying your taxes, paying your dues for the protection that you're given in this country, for the opportunities that may be presented to you, from the freedoms you may enjoy. Those are all things that are not free, and that you shouldn't be like cheating your neighbor, the protection of your neighbor, by trying to pay less for the same, for the same result,
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, I think I've just been reflecting on what you guys have been saying, and then obviously like pairing that with what we kind of are seeing in the world now, be it Portland or be it, Minneapolis or any of these things, right? So kind of this, and then even John Lewis, and John Lewis has the quote, Representative John Lewis, how he said, get in good trouble, right? So this idea of, cool, I guess taxes haven't really been something people have talked about, but, I guess like even built into the idea of paying your taxes is you're paying this entity to somehow look after your benefit, right?
Right.
It's the same way like with tithing, right? People have issues with tithing, right? Because they're like, the church entity isn't doing, where's the money going, or how is it being used? And so for me, I've just been like, I guess verse 7, because I think historically, like I wrestled with this portion of scripture, because I think a lot of times it turns into like a partisan thing, right?
Right.
Like Obama's president, oh, you should follow this, right? Or now Trump's president, oh, look, God sets up king, that whole idea, right?
That's so true.
And so I think like verse 7 is kind of giving me a little bit of solace, right? In terms of like understanding the general idea. Because I think seeing it in its context, right? Paul is talking to a group of people who it seems are kind of going against the idea of paying taxes, right? As we were saying. But in verse 7, it says, render to all what is due them. Tax to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom is due, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. So I feel like Paul is speaking within this sort of ethical idea, right? In verse 7, I feel like that's like his ethics right there. He's like, to each person is due. And so I feel like maybe, and I guess if you read the Bible in terms of not as the way that this text explicitly is read, right? As Gabriel was saying, people read it just in that one, on its own, but understanding the full story. And then on a greater sense, the whole story of the Bible, right? Where you have people like Rahab, right? Who betrayed her country in essence, right? Or you have, Paul who, as we were mentioning, like got arrested numerous times for preaching the gospel. And clearly the government didn't want him doing that. And so there's so many different elements. So it feels like there's this, it's assumed, right? Like, okay, you're going to do this, but in the broader sense of what the Bible is saying, like, I think there's room for like, because I think people try to say, I don't know what you guys think too, because I feel like there's oftentimes this idea that, and I think it disappoints us because we think that the government is somehow like God's entity, like they are like always working hand in hand. So what the government does is somehow God doing it. Like we use this text to say that, you know what I'm saying? Like,
it's true.
But that will disappoint us, right? Depending on wherever you stand on a political issue, right? Like it's going to disappoint you. And I think there's something else within this text in terms of like, and then the broad scope of the Bible and the broad scope of what the Christian responsibility is. So, that's just kind of what I'm reflecting on, right now.
Good.
I like it. I also think this text is super difficult, especially like when you consider, let's see, where is it? Verse 4, it almost seems like Paul is sanctioning the use of force. Like Paul is saying like, hey, the government can come in if you're not complying and use force and get you to comply.
Right.
And so reading that text, you're just kind of like, Paul, what are you saying, bro?
Right,
like, that eventually this is going to happen to you and you're not going to be able to get out of it. So I think also just the broader scope of scripture and what God has been doing with his people, he's been leading them out of the customs of their time. Whereas like in the Old Testament, certain things were permissible because the custom of the day was to do those things. And God led his people despite their affinity to those things. Eventually over time, he corrected them. And I think that we also have to consider that the custom, the philosophy back in Paul's day is much different than it is now. And now we have, this grand idea of democracy and freedom, equality and equity. And so I can't see Paul saying this today again. Like I just can't see it. I think that God is leading us somewhere. And as we said, other portions of scripture, you see that civil disobedience was the way to go and it was proper. I think that we have to consider that God has led us beyond just willfully surrendering our rights to a corrupt ruler and or government.
Yeah. So I want to add to what Gabe just said, simply because at least the sword analogy, perhaps he wouldn't use that analogy. He'd use a different one. But I think that he would say that to our church. I think he would say that to, Miami Temple or whatever church, you guys represent. And I think he would, because he's basically saying with the sword analogy, like, if you do what is right, why the heck are you going to be afraid of getting your head cut off by the sword? Right. You shouldn't be afraid. If you do what is wrong, then be fearful, because that could happen to you. And so especially with this whole Corona thing, like there's so many people that are like, oh, the government's taking away our rights, be afraid. And it's like just manifesting like this culture of fear in the church, and it's not a moment to be fearful. Right. It really isn't. It's a moment to do right, and as you do right, there should be no reason for you to fear at this time. And I think Paul would definitely speak those words to some of the people that I know, because if you're doing right, you have no reason to be afraid. You know.
Right. That's good. That's good. And I think what's interesting too is it, before we move on to the next part, it's just you have this idea that Paul's saying, how should the church live in light of a government that isn't pro-church or pro that religion, right? Whereas now we're living in a time where, honestly, the church's stance, and we would say, I guess, Christianity can be forced upon people in the U.S., right? And so that leads me to just a little plug to this book I'm reading called "Taking America Back for God" by Whitehead and Perry, and they talk about Christian nationalism, and I think you see it a lot. And so I don't want to give away too much of it, but how the whole idea of Christian nationalism is Christians that instead of aligning themselves with the ethics or morality, as we've been talking about, according to the Bible or according to Paul's writings and Jesus's life, they align themselves to a political party or idea or a form by which they think America should look like. And if anything is attacking that form or taking away from that form, namely, immigrants coming, Muslims, the Muslim ban, LGBTQ, anything that may take away from what they believe is the ideal, as I think Steven said it right in the beginning, or maybe Gabe, how it's this idea like this is a Christian nation founded on Christian, so it has to look Christian, it has to feel Christian. Anything that's not like that is not right. And so this idea of Christian nationalism, right, is very prevalent now. I think we see that. And it'd be interesting to hear Paul's words now. I don't think he'd be like, yo, whoa. We can't be forcing. I mean, the whole point of Romans is like, it's God's free gift. Everyone has a choice to achieve it, to receive it and whatnot. So
and to Stephen's point, like he was saying that you found solace. Is that the word you used? In that last,
solace,
in that last verse that we read. And honestly, Stephen, bro, I read it and to me it's like a challenge. Like he's probing me because it's like, and give right to whoever you owe, give whatever it is that he's talking about. And then he says, if respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. What do you guys think about people that are put in positions that are supposed to be, positions of respect and honor? And like, do you ever find yourself like really fighting this idea of like, how am I supposed to like honor this person that's in this honorable position, but the person themselves may not be an honorable person? Like how do we deal with that?
And it's and then if you throw in, especially if that person is doing something that's bringing harm to others too, that'd be that's tough. That's tough.
Yeah, that's tough. I circle back to just John the Baptist's example, how the position of honor and respect didn't stop him from holding that leader accountable to the principles and ethics of God, especially when they claim to be a follower of God and go directly opposed to what he's asking all of us to do. And so time and time again throughout the Old Testament, the prophets, that's what they did. That was their call. As Elijah did with his time. So yeah, I think we can have a level of, or maintain a level of respect towards individuals while also calling them to live up to the standards and the, I guess, morals of whatever office they hold.
Yeah.
So that's that. I don't see it as like, a dichotomy. Like it should, be in sync with each other.
Right.
That's good. Some comments here. And before I go to the comment, that's a great point. I didn't think about that, Gabe. Because Herod wasn't even, quote unquote, we would say a follower of Christ per se, right? And yet John, I think many people would be like, oh, he's not a Christian, so we don't have to hold him accountable, right?
Well, apparently he loved Jesus,
right? But it's like,
and he loved John too. So how do you like reconcile you loving the sermons that these guys preach, and then
they
number
call you
one,
out, you're like
they call you out, you chop the guy's head off. Though he was reluctant to do it,
right?
He still did it,
That's true. That's true. Maria had mentioned these points. She said, I think 13:3 has a key point. Do what is right and they will honor you. That statement has the hope that the authorities are doing right and know wrong from right, right? So it's that hope of that. She also mentions, and also we need to figure out what right is too, right? People define it differently depending on culture, religious views, political leanings, etc. Right? So one person may say this is right and the other person says no. Brandon had a point, and he says, is there a difference between doing what is right in the government's eyes and doing what is right in God's eyes? I wonder if Paul is partly referring to what is right in God's eyes, not necessarily what the government says is right, because slavery was legal once. The Holocaust was legal once. Persecution of Christians in Paul's time was legal. I think submitting means doing what God says is right. Agreed. Yeah.
Yeah. To those points, I mean, that's why I kind of like pointed to 7, right? Because I feel like it kind of gave like an overview. Because I think like, and maybe because of, you know, my own experience in America, or maybe my own thought process, I'm like, man, what if, you know, this idea that the government is somehow godly, or that
Right,
if I, you know, in verse 3, like if I somehow do good, then the government's gonna like look out for me. But what does doing good mean, right? What does doing good look like? You know, so there's so many, everyone has their own opinion on what doing good looks like.
Right.
And I think that's kind of where we are currently right now, you know, in, because I would, you know, and then so I mentioned the John Lewis quote, right? You know, because, you know, in some cases people will say that's not good, but the bringing together of two words, good trouble, right? Getting in trouble for good.
Yeah.
What does that look like? What is because the government may be saying something different than God, and this whole idea that, what does that look like? And so I feel like there it offered me some freedom to say, all right, what are the standards of God? Where do I go? Right. Cause I think as a Christian, right. And as a Christian in America and in this time period, I think like, I feel like I need that reminder in some ways that what God is saying is different than maybe sometimes what the government is saying, or maybe different than what, you know, I may be seeing around me. Like what God is calling me to is different. And so, you know, that gives me some of that freedom, because there was a government that you could even say God placed X leader in this position, right? If I say that makes me feel like I need to just
blindly follow, right?
Yeah, just shut my mouth and kind of take whatever happens. But then you get into other issues of, you know, how much do you take versus, you know, non-violent. I mean, there's so much in this, like, you know, so that's, you know, so that's so I appreciate the points that Maria and Brandon that they made. Yeah.
No, that's good. And then if you think about it too, the people that, you know, the church and state joined together to crucify and kill Jesus, right? So religious leaders and the state persecuted and crucified Jesus. So I don't think Paul is, I mean, I think we definitely misuse that, right? The authorities that exist have been established by God. So they're divinely appointed. And again, culturally, contextually, it's a different mindset, totally different setup of government that Paul is speaking into and that we're speaking into now. Sure, God's hand is in it. He's still sovereign. He's in control. But I mean, he's not the one. I was just gonna say I'm not gonna go into it, but yeah, he's not the one saying this person is gonna be there and that. I think a lot of people holding Christian nationalist views think this is God's, and I've heard it right from even Donald Trump. This is God's elected, his anointed. He's our modern day Messiah, which you're like, yeah. But you got to see the whole picture, right? You gotta, you know,
except when, you know, you have to wear a mask and, you know, church buildings are closed, then Romans 13 doesn't apply anymore. Apparently, you know.
But we just pick and choose, you know, like, you know, and that's the difficulty, right?
Yeah, So at the core, I think Paul has been laying the foundation. Loyalty to God comes before anything else. And kind of the first point that Brian made is just you just have to try as much as possible, live a good life in relations to those around you, right? Because we are foreigners here. We're pilgrims. This is not our permanent home. We're only here for a moment. And so in that idea, I don't know if anybody else has any comment on this section here. If not, we're going to.
I just want to reiterate this point. It seems that the thrust of the text is Paul getting to that last section in verse 7.
Yeah.
Paying taxes, the customs, the honor, the fear, giving that and rendering that to the leader. So it seems like the Romans were trying to weasel their way out of paying taxes. So it seems like that's the context of this text.
And he's also a pastor missionary, right? So he's like, anything that takes time away from planting churches is a waste of my time right now, right? It's like, I need to be out here. So try not to mess with authorities, follow the building codes, build right. And let's just preach, his, as we'll get to, right? And we'll just move into it. He really thinks Jesus is coming that soon, that he's like, we really can't get invested in little petty stuff. Just do what's right as much as possible that doesn't contradict your loyalty to God. And then he moves on to, and we'll read those verses 8 to 10 here. Along the lines of owing something, he says, let no debt remain outstanding, right? So he's talking about taxes, revenue, respect, honor, except the only thing you can leave as a debt that you have is the continuing debt to love one another. For whoever loves others has fulfilled the law. The commandments: you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and whatever other commandment there may be, are summed up in this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. Because love does no harm to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfillment of the law. Where does student loans fit into this, do you guys think?
That's definitely not part of love.
That's not.
No.
Any thoughts here? The only
maybe that's what the Romans were doing. They weren't paying back their student loans.
He's like, guys, come on. You guys saw all the.
Dude, honestly, I love that, man. The only debt you should have is love. Like, there's no such thing as loving someone enough for Paul. It's like, oh, I showed this much love to you. There, pay my dues. I'm out. Right. It's like, that's a debt that you will always have with everyone around you, is that you can never love them enough. And I love that he ties that in with the fulfillment of the law, right? Because that's another debt that we could have never paid, right? And so, yeah, I don't know. I'm still thinking.
I want to kind of just like say that I love how Paul describes love here as the fulfillment of the law, and loving, like doing the things to your neighbor that, of course, are, positive, and your neighbor being also perhaps the ruling authorities. And so the love that he's saying that we, I guess, owe one another is not this, as Ty Gibson would say, the warm, fuzzy feeling.
Right.
It's living towards someone in relational covenant, right? I don't have to like the person who sits in the White House to show them love. I don't have to like them personally. Their personality doesn't have to complement mine. Mine doesn't have to complement theirs. I could actually be opposed to them in so many different ways. Yet my call is from God to love them as a neighbor and to treat them with respect and dignity and honor, to never violate that covenant that God has established. So I think that's important. We can disagree publicly with rulers as well, but we should always love our neighbor. And I think the opposite is true as well for authorities, right? You don't have to like those who you rule over, but you should love your neighbor as yourself.
Right.
Yeah, this is super powerful, man. Because something that I've always thought, because I think a lot of times in these situations, like when you hear like you should love your neighbor as yourself, or you should do wrong to no one, like it doesn't sound profound like at first, right? You're like, oh yeah, obviously. But I think like in the once you start talking politics, or once you start talking about issues, right? What's happening in your community, all of a sudden it turns into this. All of a sudden you're losing sight that these are actually people. These are actually people affected by it, and how is this ethic, this idea that I should love my neighbor, how all of a sudden that gets lost in the mix of a political discussion or a discussion on your opinion, right? Because I think oftentimes something that I would say is many times when we politicize things, right, we begin to subconsciously dehumanize them in the process, right? We're talking about immigration and we aren't talking about a mother and her child. We're talking about our opinion on immigration versus, you know, an actual family, right? Our neighbor. And so there's so many things that mix in with that. And I think here is just a good reminder, like Gabe was saying, you may dislike the person in the White House. You may dislike your pastor, your city council member, whoever it is, right? You may dislike those people. But at the end of the day, that's your neighbor. And there's a responsibility within that throws dignity on them, the image of God, all these different things that come into play that I think complicate what we maybe in our hearts may feel in terms of, man, I'm angry, man, I want to do something that is wrong to this person, and you know, one of the ways I gauged too, you know, how I felt was like, man, could I invite this person that I dislike or I very much disagree with? Would I be able to sit down with them and have lunch with them, right? And see them as a person and not have a discussion on where we disagree, but sit down and have a neighborly discussion, right? Because what drove them into maybe having these views? Because I think in that midst of those conversations, in the midst of humanizing somebody, we can begin to see where there is common ground, right? Where there is this. So, you know, I think at first, right, I think no matter who you say it to, no one's going to disagree that, you know, we should love our neighbor as ourselves, right? Everybody agrees with that, I think, for the most part. But the question then is, you know, as was asked to Christ, you know, who is my neighbor? And then what does that mean? How do I treat my neighbor? And, you know, it's difficult to do in 2020, but I think the same point that Paul makes, you know, back here is relevant now.
Yeah. Well said.
That's good. Yeah. I think a lot of it has to do with just in the book of Romans, right? It's so easy just to focus on a section of Romans, and just living a life in the way that God has lived towards us, right? I think of Romans 5, where Paul's like, I mean, while you were still enemies of God, he died for you. He demonstrated his love for you, right? So it's just like, I think now in chapter 12 on, Paul's just saying, okay, how do we, because it's interesting that he didn't mention, you know, loving God and putting God first and loyalty to God. He just went straight to like relational, what's going on. And I'm wondering, kind of what to Gabe's point, right, of not paying taxes, how much people had been kind of like, oh, I'm a Christian now, and my loyalty, like I don't have to do anything the emperor says. I don't have to, because my loyalty is not to him; it's only to God, right? I'm free from my social contract with my community. And Paul's kind of saying like, no, you're still in this work, like you're still in this community, so you still got to be able to, you still got to respect, pay your taxes, bro. Like, you know, revenue, like do the right things, you know, and as much as possible, love your neighbor and do no harm to your neighbor, right? This is literally fulfilling the law. So it's beautiful there that the only debt that we owe people is love, and you can never outgive that. Maria says this point, I like the commentary in the Bible I'm using, 13:8. She says, why is love for others called a debt? We're permanently in debt to Christ for the love he lavished on us. The only way we can even begin to repay this debt is by loving others in turn, because Christ's love will always be infinitely greater than ours. We will always have the obligation to love our neighbor. Yeah, beautiful quote there. We can never outlove God, and we just got to be, as Stephen was saying, right, be able to see those we oppose with, whether politically, religiously, lifestyles, and sit down with them and say, no, you're still a human. I still see you and I still love you. So good points.
Yeah, great stuff.
This love does no harm to a neighbor. It kind of kills me a little bit inside, to be honest with you, because I read that, and at least as a white male, and looking into love and looking into what we've been living through in 2020, what our eyes have been open to, I see this, and I don't believe that to harm your neighbors, to physically harm them or to directly harm that person. But the fact that for 20 odd years, I had been silent to the need and the cry of my neighbor is to harm them, you know? And I think that when you look at love, when you look at the way that Paul talks about love, you realize that it's not only a call for you to act on behalf of someone else, but it's a call for you to look within yourself and see how broken you are, you know? And the only way you can start living for someone else is to realize how life is like for you. And this passage, you know, love does no harm to a neighbor. it really makes you think. It's like, man, have I been harming my neighbor? And therefore, the sentence that precedes it, love your neighbor as yourself, is like, man, maybe I never learned how to love myself, you know? Yeah. And so it's this give and take of like, yes, I need to learn how to love myself, but also, man, I need to learn how to love my neighbor. And they're interconnected, they're intertwined in such a way that you can't say that you have a love for one without having a love for the other. And I think that is profound, and that's precisely something that Jesus had to come to earth to show us. Yeah. We were never seeing it on our own.
Yeah, I think that the ethic that Paul is giving the church in Rome is the same ethic that applies to leaders as well, right? That love does no harm to a neighbor, and no matter where you're living, no matter what government you're under, that is a universal truth. Love does no harm to a neighbor.
Yeah, it's a universal principle. That's good. That's good. So we continue in this context. Or do you have something, Steven?
Yeah. Sorry, I was muted. No, just the point that Brian made was super. Is hitting me a lot because I think it's super powerful. Like in terms of, because I think harm. I think we easily kind of say is just, well, I don't actively engage in hurting my neighbor, right? I'm not physically hurting them, but I don't think something that I hear very commonly, to Brian's point, is, well, if everybody just kind of looks out for themselves, right? If they're good people, I'm good, right? Or if they don't hurt me, I don't hurt them, right? And this sort of idea that's somehow enough, I think doesn't fit in line with what this is. Because I think with loving your neighbor, there's this sort of active participation in loving. Like you can't say you love your wife and just be like, oh yeah, she leaves me alone, I'm however nice she is to me, that's how nice I'm gonna be, right? Like that's not really a successful. I mean, there are people that live their marriage like that, but that's a separate conversation. But this whole thing that Brian was saying, like, I think there's so much more to what harm looks like, to what it means to love. It's not the way it's uncomfortable in some ways. I think Paul isn't speaking about something that's comfortable or easy. He's saying like it's going to be difficult to love your neighbor, and your neighbor isn't just the person that lives next door to you or the person that looks like you or any of that. It's so much more difficult, and how you could harm without knowing, right? Because you see the sort of conflict resolution things that exist in the Bible. When it says like, if you think someone is against you, I think we talked about that the other day. If you think someone is against you, go and make it right. Right. If you might be harming them, go make it right. Go check on that. And so it's just powerful, man, what Brian said and how that interacts with this verse.
Yeah. It seems unnatural too, like you're saying, right? And I think that's why this is just kind of like what it looks like to live by the Spirit, right? It's not natural to our normal to look out for ourselves. It's the Spirit that works in us to produce the fruits of Jesus Christ in loving others and putting others first. And so with that, Paul, I think, couches all this in the context of Jesus is coming, being very near, right? So I'm just going to read those verses here, 11 to 14. It says, and do this, understanding the present time. The hour has already come for you to wake up from your slumber, because our salvation is nearer now than when we first believed. The night is nearly over, the day is almost here, so let us put aside the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light. Let us behave decently as in the daytime, not in carousing and drunkenness, not in sexual immorality and debauchery, not in dissension and jealousy. Rather, clothe yourselves with the Lord Jesus Christ, and do not think about how to gratify the desires of the flesh. So obviously, I think everything here, obviously, he just keeps building, right? His progression as he goes from chapter to chapter. And here, just talking about, live in light of the reality of the nearness of Jesus' coming, right? That Paul and they were like, yeah, Jesus is coming in our lifetime, and everything that they were doing and deciding to do was just enclosed in that reality that they thought, man, he's going to be here. And not just that, but our salvation is nearer now than when we first believed. So I guess my question to you guys is how should the nearness of Jesus' coming affect how we live and make decisions on the day to day? I don't know if anybody wants to take that. How does the nearness of Jesus' return, especially now that we're like thousands of years removed from Paul, and he was living like with that urgency, how much should we be living with that urgency, and how does that affect our day to day, I guess, in our relationship with others?
Hola, sí, acabo de llamar a este número acerca de una cita para.
Or Gabe?
Yeah, that was good. Good
Nani.
feedback, Nani. I think that the way Paul describes it is interesting. He says in verse 12 to put on the armor of light, and then he says in verse 14 to put on the Lord Jesus Christ. And that last verse, he says, put on the Lord Jesus Christ, make no provision for the flesh to fulfill its lusts. And so essentially our, I guess our duty is obviously to live in the light of Jesus' second coming, and living in the light of his second coming is putting on the Lord Jesus Christ, right? And I think that I'm reminded of Philippians chapter 2, having the same mind that was in Christ Jesus, to not regard yourself as better than others, to have a spirit of servitude, and that spirit of love that he mentions just before this, loving your neighbor. And that's the fulfillment of the law. So there is obviously the fulfillment. When you're wearing flesh, you fulfill lusts. But when you're wearing Christ, when you have the mind that was in Christ Jesus, you're going to fulfill the law, which is to love your neighbor and do no harm to them. So I think that is the reality of living in the light of Jesus' second coming, that it's much sooner than we think. And of course, Paul and most of the disciples, they believed that Jesus was coming back in their lifetime. Like, that was what they thought, and that's why they worked with such vigor and passion. And so we believe that, of course, prophetically, he is coming soon. And I think that most of us would agree, just seeing all the things that's happened in the last couple of months, so that should propel us to do more and love better. So yeah, that's my thought. That's how I see it.
That's good. Brandon had this point here. He said, interesting that both Paul and many in our Adventist faith, right, tradition, believe that Jesus will appear in their lifetime. Yeah, I remember my mom would always tell me about my grandfather not wanting to get married because Jesus was coming in his lifetime. And then, I had my mom, and then my mom too, right? She's like, I'm not going to go to college because Jesus is coming soon. So maybe we'll just stay and preach. Or goes to college. I'm not going to get married. I'm not going to have kids. And then here I am.
Yeah. And when you consider that death is just a sleep, like, I mean,
technically,
Jesus is coming technically in
for
their
everyone.
lifetime.
Yeah. Right.
In the disciples' lifetime, they close their eyes and they wake up, and boom, second coming.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that it's hilarious how the second coming, for some reason, particularly in Adventists, produces this sense of, let me stop doing because Jesus is coming, instead of like, let's do more because he's coming.
Right.
And
Talk about it.
I mean, I'm lucky enough that I literally just.
Hey, Seb, on that solo frame of just Brian.
Yeah, here we go. We got to put him on. That was a word. That's a word.
No, but I recently had to preach. It was my turn, right? To speak at church, and we were covering the two books of Thessalonians, the two letters that Paul writes there. And something that you'll see consistently throughout Paul's writings is he's going to bring up the second coming. Like, no matter what the heck he's talking about, he's going to bring up the second coming. And the reason for this, I think, is because for Paul, the second coming, that's his vision, right? For anything that he does, his vision is the second coming. That's what he's looking forward to. And he does these little snippets of like vision casting throughout his letters of like, hey, what we're looking towards is the second coming of Jesus. And throughout his letters, you'll see the vision, which is the second coming of Jesus. You'll see the mission, which is always people, like how to get along with people, how to be, better neighbors, how to love them. And then the strategy is always for Paul something that is relational. And so he goes through that on each one of his letters. And so here, as he brings it up, man, that's his vision. That's Paul doing some vision casting. And if you take the time to think about Jesus' second coming, you're going to really just take the time to imagine it. It should produce in you the desire to reach out, to be engaged in mission with people, and to do it through the strategy that works, which is relational, not intellectual.
Yeah. Like, we're just talking about Jesus coming soon, or, the urgency or things like that. And obviously, like, the way 2020 has kind of played out, right? I think a lot of people are currently grappling with this whole idea, right? And I think, like, as Brian was saying, like, built into our DNA as Adventists, right? There's this sort of like idea, well, maybe it's like working, but how are you working, right? What are you working and researching, right? And I think, like, for many of us, we're following to see, like, what's the Pope doing, right? That's gonna get me ready, right? That lets me know that it's near, right? Or he's coming to he's gonna come before Congress, like that lets me know he's ready, right? Or we're looking for these signs, right? Coronavirus is a sign that Jesus is coming soon. But when you pair it, right, we're pairing it with something parallel that happened in 1918, right? So, like, right. So then you're like, people said that in 1918, right? So now you're creating these, no one likes pointing that out. But I think, like, what Paul is really saying, like, the signs and things that you should know, like salvation is near, is actually what he said before, love your neighbor. Like, every time you see somebody in need, every time you see a situation, that's the reminder that person needs to know that Christ is coming for them. That's the reminder that person needs to know that I care about them. So I think a lot of times we get caught up in these signs of big things, right? So we become like sensationalists, right? We're waiting for the next big thing that's going to jumpstart our faith. When Christ looks at the sheep and the goats and says, "What'd you do to the least of these? Like, how did you love?" Right? And they look at Christ and say, "Man, if we had known you were behind them, we would have done something, right? If we had known, if only we knew, I would have done something." But Paul is saying, regardless of if you know, everybody you see, I need you to know. So essentially, like, everything we see around us are reminders that salvation is near. And as we're doing that, like, all these other things that he lists out later, if we want to talk about promiscuity, sensual, all these different jealousy, all these different things, you don't really even have the time to really engage with that, because I feel like you're so focused on loving actively the way Christ calls us to. And as someone commented, too, like, this debt that we have, like, we have an understanding of that debt. We have a debt to those around us to point them to a God who's paid our debt. So there's it's beautiful,
dude. That's good, bro. That's good. I think, man, that's great. I think there's two responses to this, right? When we see the urgency of Christ, some people interpret, I think, the kingdom of God as in, like, making now look like what heaven will be like, in the sense of, I think, government powers and stuff, and which is kind of the idea of Christian nationalism, right? We have to make this look Christian. Whereas when Jesus comes, he's like he was saying, right? It's like, did you care for others? Did you love others? Did you feed the homeless? And I can imagine a lot of the people that would say the same arguments about, anti-maskers or people that say, I don't care about others. It's like, it would be like, well, Jesus, I mean, the hunger is just a state of mind. I didn't want to help them because I don't want, we don't want to give handouts to people, right? Or why didn't you close the naked? Well, it's because, I mean, they got to work for their own, I pulled myself up by my bootstraps,
Jesus helps those who helps themselves.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's like, it's interesting that, the nearness of God, the urgency kind of has people move in different directions where, like, and that's what this book on Christian nationalism has really got me thinking. Is, people will just say, well, it's just making the government look more like a Christian church and the values of what the Bible, I believe, teaches, rather than the freedom that God provides for people to choose for whatever they want for themselves. And instead of addressing humanitarian needs that now have been labeled as social, justice issues and social justice warriors, and it's like a liberal issue, That's what Jesus comes back asking if you did. He's not saying if you went to church, did you tithe? Did you, stand up? Did you vote for the right party? It's like, no, what did you do to the least of these around you?
Yeah.
And that urgency, I think, allows you to have to think about that. How am I living on my day to day? Is it, living by my own agenda, or really loving others? And treating others the way that Jesus wants me to treat them, with love, right? Not, that's the debt that we owe to others, for treating love and actually meeting physical needs, right? We're not here just so much of our religion, I think, as SDAs, when we talk about urgency and prophecy, right? Talking about end times, is always about knowledge and intellectually. You got to get out of Babylon, right? Which is true, right? You got to, and just mindset, you got to believe the Sabbath is the right day, but we almost never
You gotta become vegan.
Right. But we never talk about Steven's not opposed to that. We never talk about like the relational, aspect of it, right? That's not just about knowledge. It's about actually, healing and bringing actual physical felt changes to our community. So, man,
yeah,
a lot there.
Yeah.
I like that. Armor of light. That reminds me of something I would have heard him in a Pathfinder camporee, right? Guys, put on the armor of light.
Something that's also that I want to bring out real quick, as we're finishing up, I guess, is like when you envision heaven, who do you see there? And who you see there is probably what you're going to be most tempted to help out here. And it's very difficult for some people in our church to see different races and to see different ideologies, people that represent different things, different lifestyles, right? And so chances are, if you're imagining heaven right now and you can't see a black person, or you can't see a foreigner, or you can't see a gay person, it's like, it's going to be very difficult for you to be able to help that person out here and now. And so something that Paul speaks to, I believe, when he talks about this vision casting, is, bro, Jesus, he came to give his life for the entire world, not just you who, not just for those who would believe in him, but for everyone, regardless if they come to believe or not. And so with that in mind, and as you envision heaven, you should be able to picture those people in heaven alongside you and help them as well. So I think we would benefit from taking the time to actually do that.
That's good. All right. So as we close up here, as Brian has ushered us into that time, big takeaway for today. We spend a lot of time talking about the government, our relation to the government. Any big takeaway for this morning from Romans 13?
Yeah, make sure you send your vote.
Vote.
Yeah.
Do your civic duty. I thought you were gonna say do your tax returns, but
yeah,
you might be a little late for that.
Yeah. So,
I mean, even if you are, you should still do them.
Yeah.
Even if they're late.
Yeah.
They'll get it somehow.
So,
send them in.
Big takeaway for me is that verse in verse 10. A shout out to Rodley. Thanks, man.
Yo, long story short, man, plug Rodley's brother Ron actually goes to my church, and he's on our communication team. So,
get out of town.
It's really crazy. Yeah. So Rodley, shout out to your brother. Shout out to Ron. Yeah, and it's super easy to vote by mail-in ballot. I actually have my mail-in ballot here. I got to fill out too. So,
absolutely.
Do it.
Right.
Who's going? Gabe, you're going?
Yeah. So that verse 10, love does no harm to a neighbor.
Brody says LOL. Just keep interrupting Gabe.
Yeah, it's all good, man.
I'm kidding, man.
Just get it out, Rodley. All at once. I even think that love might look like making sure that you vote this November. So love does no harm to a neighbor. That's my big takeaway.
That's good.
Yeah, I second that. I like that
for
for sure.
sorry, I just want to jump on that before I move on. And just even how we vote should mirror or reflect, right, this view of loving your neighbor, right? And so many times the way we vote, it's like, all right, what's going to bring me the most interest and benefit me the most. But in this light, it's like, oh yeah, do your civic duties, but do it in a way that brings love, not harm to your neighbor.
Or at least pick someone who brings the least harm.
Amen. Amen.
This is truth.
That's true. No, that's true.
Yeah, but my big takeaway, like Gabe was saying, is verse 10, love does no harm to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfillment of the law. And Jesus talks about it, love God and love your neighbor. And the fulfillment of that law is to go about it this way that Paul is saying. And so, yeah, if you're doing your neighbor no harm, chances are you're loving them correctly. And yeah,
that's good.
Yeah, I guess for me, love is how I summarize. Love is active. Love is something that results in action. And whether that's voting, whether that is, feeding the homeless, whether that is calling up somebody and checking in on them, like love is active. And I think as we practice and act out love, we will simultaneously fulfill the law. Like we will get to the core of what the law is, and at the core of the law was love, right? Is love, and as we strive for it, whether it's in the government or in our church or in our home, like if we look to love, right, the love that we were given, right, the debt that has been paid for us, as we look to that, we will, I think, find ourselves aligning and coming close to areas where we didn't think we would, where without love, whereas as Sebi was saying, like when we vote or when we think about things, how am I going to benefit from this? But I think love calls you to say, how's everybody going to benefit from this? How are those that I may not even know, how are they going to benefit from this?
Yeah.
And it's a shift in thinking. It's a fundamental shift that I think is powerful, man. Like,
well said. Well said, man.
In that vein too, I think just that in this life, living in the reality that you've already, attained the maximum, God's salvation and righteousness, like what we live now is not trying to make myself advanced, right? And I think that's where Paul's idea, right, in Philippians says, like, I've learned to be content in all areas for the fact of being able to preach this gospel so that others can be good too. And so I think I guess we're all going with this, in terms of voting and being loving to others. Just being even extra is how is this policy or this person, this politician in my government, my city council gonna help not me necessarily, but everyone else. And so I think that if Christians were living, following the principles of the Bible, we're living that way, I think people would be like, man, this is cool, man. I wanna follow in your footsteps. I want to know the God that you believe in, that isn't necessarily interested in, he died so that others could have life, right? That's the level of self-sacrifice that I think none of us have shown in this lifetime. But we're called to model and live under. So
to Stephen's point, then I guess my big takeaway, like personally, would be like, yeah, man, I owe a lot of love, dude. And it's not something that you think about, every day, but reading this chapter with you guys and your comments, I realized that, man, I am so in debt, to love people. So it's time to pay it forward.
Time to pay it forward, man. Go to Starbucks, pay for the person behind you. I don't know. That's the other pay forward. All right, guys. Thank you for joining us. Fridays at 10 a.m. We'll be back. I also drop there. We're almost at the end of Romans. If you have any book or idea that you think would be cool for us to cover or talk about, drop it in the comment section. We'd love to talk about it and see where we move from here. But thanks for joining us. Also, shout out always to Maria, and Brandon, Rodley, Nani, everyone else that tuned in and was watching here and there. We thank you guys for the participation. Love you all. Share it with others in your feeds so that we can get some traction. Shout out to Las Doñas. If you haven't followed them yet, it's called Las Doñas, right?
Yeah.
Las Doñas.
Las Doñas
Hablan on Instagram. I don't know if they have a Facebook.
You heard a snippet today.
You heard a snippet.
Yeah.
That was one of the.
That was one of the doñas talking. Follow them on Instagram. They're gonna do great things. That they're starting up soon with some content and sharing different things. So shout out, shameless plug to them, because obviously they're our wives. So we're happy for them. So yeah, we'll see you
They're
all.
your wives.
Yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, Gabe's working on it. Bro, you gotta put it there on your little Fridays at 10 a.m. Put a little hashtag Las Doñas or something.
What's there? I was trying to see that.
We're at.
But when is their stuff is not? When is their coming out?
I don't know what it is.
Bro, they're being secretive.
No, so I know. Number one fan. So let me give you the.
So their first album drops on. Is that how it is? Las Doñas album.
Las Doñas hablan.
I don't know.
Yeah. Oh, it's Las Donas. Las Donas.
Las Donas.
Yeah, there's no in.
Las Donas hablan on Instagram. So follow them. We're happy. We're actually. I'm really proud and excited for them. Not
Boston cream donuts.
Las Donas hablan. And yeah, so follow them on Insta. They're gonna do great things. They're already doing great things. So
Maria says they're being organized properly.
Oh,
I believe that.
Dang, is that a burn? Like to.
First of all,
no, wait. I don't know.
Yeah, Maria, what you talking about? You're being organized properly. It's a dig.
I just want to say this was all Seba's idea and his.
Took a turn.
I'm a 9. I can't make decisions, so that's that. Enneagram 9, so that's what happens. But haters. So Nani is one of the co-founders there. So thank you, Nani, for tuning in.
That was the doña you heard today.
La doña you heard today. So awesome, guys. We'll see you all next week on Friday at 10. We'll see you all. God bless. Have a great weekend. Remember, go love your neighbor and vote properly. Get that mail-in ballot. Check out where your voting stations are if you're not going to vote, if you want to vote in person. And at the same time, this is one of my friends challenged me on Instagram. Try to get 5 people that you know to vote, and tell those 5 people to invite 2 people or 3 people to vote so we can get this going, especially among young people. It's so easy for us to get so disillusioned with reality that we're like, my voice doesn't count, but your vote counts. So
yeah,
encourage that. So